One of the most important decisions a member of the United States Senate, and only members of the United States Senate, make is advise and consent on who gets a lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court in our country is the final voice of what is the law of the land on reproductive rights, on voting rights, on civil rights, on LGBTQ rights, and a whole host of other things. So it is a momentous decision. I voted against Justice Gorsuch because I did not feel that he would both protect a woman's right to choose, and I felt that he would end up being an activist judge. And if you look at the past rulings, just this last week or so, on Janus, on collective bargaining rights, on a whole host, on other health care issues that are related, Gorsuch ended up being a bad justice of the Supreme Court for average New Jerseyans. As a result of Gorsuch being there, and as a result if someone follows the same Gorsuch model, we will end Roe v. Wade as we know it. We will end women's reproductive health. We will move back on voting rights. We will move back on civil rights, as the court is already chipping away on that. If the president is committed to only taking names from where the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society created this list, probably not. Why? The president has made it very clear, both as a candidate and subsequent as president of the United States, that he will only appoint pro-life justices. He will only appoint conservative justices. He will only appoint those who follow his views. We need someone who will follow the rule of law, not Trump's law. And at the end of the day, if he's committed to accepting only individuals from a list by organizations that clearly have a total opposition to women's reproductive health, I do not find it possible to support someone like that. As it relates to my colleagues, I think my colleagues understand the momentous nature of this decision. And even though it may be difficult for them, in their states, I think that they will understand that this is far more important. This is a generational choice that will follow for the better part. If this person gets confirmed, that will change the court 5-4 for a generation. And that's a long time of bad decisions. That's what's at stake. The stakes have never been higher. When I voted against the Iraq War, my vote was an unpopular vote in a congressional district at the time that had lost hundreds of people on September 11th, and I was sharply criticized for it. But for me, it was a momentous decision, because a vote for war and peace is a vote that sends our sons and daughters into harm's way. And so it's a vote of life and death. And I felt that the war in Iraq was, not justified. I spent all the time in the intelligence room looking at the evidence that was available to any member who would have taken the time, and I saw there was no clear and present danger to the United States, no imminent threat, and no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And that vote ended up proving itself in time to be the right vote. And those who excoriated me about it at the beginning, subsequently, many of them came to say, you were right. That's the nature of this vote on the Supreme Court. My colleagues need to understand, and I think they do from the conversations that have already taken place since the announcement of Justice Kennedy that he will not continue on the court, that there is therefore a vacancy. I think my colleagues, even in the toughest of states, understand that this will be a decision that will follow them for the rest of their lives. And so in that momentous nature, and I think if you make the arguments back at home as to why you opposed a nomination, if that's what you choose to do, I think people will appreciate your independence and your judgment at the end of the day. But Republicans changed the rules as to the filibuster of a Supreme Court nominee. Instead of making it a 60-vote threshold, they made it to a simpler 51-vote threshold. And so the procedural abilities to tie up the nomination for an extended period of time has been undermined by their change of the rules. That's why I think it's so important, so important. If there was ever a time for citizen participation to raise their voices with all of their representatives, and particularly their members of the Senate, it's now. It's now. If you care about any of these things, if you care about reproductive rights. Roe v. Wade is not written in the Constitution. It was decided by case law. Civil rights ultimately was advanced by legislation that became law and cases that were decided, starting with Brown versus the Board of Education and moving on to its progeny. Voting rights have been preserved by the struggle of individuals as well as by laws that then were defended against and challenges in the court going all the way to the Supreme Court, who makes the final decision, and so much more. And so whether children can be stripped away from their mothers at a border is going to be decided ultimately by the Supreme Court. So it's going to take the voices of Americans to rise, and hopefully some of our Republican colleagues who are more moderate, like Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, just to mention a couple, will truly think about this vote and will join us in opposing someone who would roll back the clock to a time and place I don't believe any of us want to go to. If you're a woman, as I've said, you know, the whole issue, not just the question of abortion, reproductive health rights is at stake. If you're an African American and you remember the history of this country where slavery was an original sin, you're going to appreciate the nature of a Supreme Court that could roll back the clock. If you've struggled to go to vote and been challenged or had efforts to try to suppress a vote, you're going to understand that. If you had a pre-existing condition and were denied health care coverage in the past, and the law hasn't changed that, the Supreme Court is going to decide ultimately on the Affordable Care Act. And the President made it very clear that he is not appointing a mistake, his words, like Justice Roberts, who upheld part of the Affordable Care Act, which means he's going to appoint someone who is going to undermine the Affordable Care Act.